Loops are an important part of programming. They help you do things that are very difficult to do otherwise, especially with lists and data sets, groups of data, where you have to perform the same operation on multiple different variables, and the variables are all the same data type. They are basically the same type of sensor, or basically anything really, or there may be different samples of the same temperature input. Things like that require you to, in a single set of lines, be able to perform the same operation many times. If you had to code a single line for every operation you wanted to run on one element in a group of data elements, it would become very expensive to run operations like querying databases, and operations on data sets would be very expensive, because you would have to code basically every single one of those operations. Instead, by looping, you can, with minimum development and engineering, perform many operations on data sets. We have three types of loops in structure work. We have the while loop, A is more than B. Come here and run this code. Oh, and compiler, when you're done, come back and check this condition once again. Now, the compiler would have only done this if A was actually greater than B, and this statement proved to be true. Had this been false and B was greater than A, or A was equal to B, the compiler would have actually just skipped all that code altogether and had come here and continue running the rest of the program's code. However, if A was actually greater than B, and this tested to be a true condition, then the compiler would come here and execute all this code. Then it would come back up and check, and if A remained greater than B, it would then loop back through all the code. Or there was a condition in here that specified a break statement, which is just basically saying break me out of this loop, and that's a keyword break. The repeat until would basically have the compiler get here to this line of code, and then this is actually where it would say you'd have something that would say repeat and then you'd have code inside this repeat loop, and then you'd have another keyword which would be until less than B, maybe. The difference between the two infinite loops, because in theory, if we don't have A and B coded properly, or if we could just say while true, So what happens if we do this? Now, what will this do? See, it will forever loop. And when will it stop? It will stop when we overflow OA temp, because we attempt to add OA temp, add 1 to OA temp, where OA temp eventually is just going to reach its max possible number. Who knows, however million or billion or trillion, but eventually it's going to hit a limit and it's going to overflow the data type for this program, for the numeric, basically. So that is the danger, and this will just run. It will compile and it will run successfully until you hit the limit of how much, how many decimals you can store on this variable based on its data type. So that's why this is dangerous, and I would avoid it. There's really no need for it. Now for the repeat until. Looks something like this. You could say repeat OA temp equals OA temp plus 1 until false. No, that will just execute. And for as long false is false and false is not true, which will be until eternity, because false will always be false, logically, right? As far as the processor is concerned, false would never be true, but the processor is waiting for false to become true miraculously in order to get out of this loop, which it won't happen. Again, we're gonna hit a limit on the number of decimals we can store in OA temp, and then we're gonna overflow, and it'll be a runtime error that if you're doing a B3 controller, you will not be able to debug. And if you're debugging, you basically have to run the thing in debugging for who knows how long until you hit that limit. Now our for loop, in our for loop, we're actually doing this. For, so we have OA temp. We've declared it. You can initialize OA temp inside your for loop, and that means you can assign its first value. You can assign OA temp, the variable OA temp, its first value right inside the for loop, in the beginning statement or opening statement of your for loop. So pay attention to how the editing tool, the script editing tool, highlights the word for and the word to in different colors. So that means they're keywords, and they're part of this programming construct, which is the for loop. Same as the while loop and the return until was they were also looping programming constructs. So here we're going to say OA temp equals OA temp plus 1. Next, OA temp, and then we can say OA temp equals 0. So now let's run this. So by design, this looping construct is a finite looping construct, because in its design there is an intent to put a definite limit on the number of times we're going to loop. So before you start running the code inside the loop, you already know how many times you're going to iterate over that code, which in this case would be line 4. In the other two statements, this was not the case. We had no idea for how long this code is going to run. We have no idea for how long this code's going to run before we start running it. And indeed, in this particular case, as we already saw before, this code will just run until eternity, except if we, for example, we could put something in here that says if OA temp equals 6, then break. Now let's see what happens with this. And that's a way to break out of that loop. Now, this will also work on the repeat until. The only difference between a while loop and a repeat until loop is that the repeat until loop will run the code inside it at least once, whereas the while loop, if we do this, it will not run what's inside the code ever, not even the first time. However, if this was a repeat until, it most certainly would. Okay, we did 2, but that's it. It does no more. So I run it once, we ended up with 2, but it does not run it anymore. However, by initializing here, we're forcing this variable to go back to 1 every time. So now if we do this and we turn this back to false so that it will execute what's inside the loop, we should see a different behavior here. More like what we were observing in the while loop. Obviously, these looping constructs were actually meant to be used in this fashion, not necessarily using the break statement or the break keyword. But if you are going to use them, having some extra safeties in there with break statements can help a great deal, I imagine.